A girl disappeared while walking home from school, but 7 months later, a stray cat leads police to a hidden barn. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment where in the world you're watching from. Let's go. The amber glow of the dashboard clock read 2:37 a.m. as Officer Mark Thompson stared at the faded photograph taped to his patrol car's dash. His daughter Emma's smile beamed back at him, frozen in time from 7 months ago. 7 months, 2 weeks, and 3 days to be exact. His police radio crackled with static, then the weary voice of his sergeant broke through. "Thompson, this is the 3rd time tonight. Return to the station. That's an order." Mark's thumb hovered over the radio button, but he didn't press it. Instead, he adjusted the photo, smoothing out a curling corner. This was his 212th unauthorized patrol of the neighborhood since Emma disappeared. The department had officially scaled back the search 5 months ago. Officially, not completely, they'd said. But Mark knew what that meant. He rubbed his bloodshot eyes, feeling the stubble that had grown beyond regulation length. His uniform, once pressed to perfection each morning, now bore the wrinkles of someone who'd slept in his car more often than his bed. "Just one more block," he whispered to himself. His mind flashed back to that afternoon. Emma, 14 and full of life, bouncing on her toes as she asked, "Dad, can I go to Jenna's house? Just for a few hours?" He'd been distracted, reviewing case files. He'd nodded without looking up. "Be back by dinner." That was the last time he'd seen her. The radio crackled again. This time, Mark switched it off. The streets were empty, houses dark except for the occasional porch light. As he turned down Maple Street, something caught his eye. A faint light flickered in the second-story window of the abandoned Whitaker property. The house had been vacant for years, foreclosed and forgotten after the 2008 crash. Mark slowed the car, squinting at the window. The light disappeared, then reappeared, as if someone were moving with a flashlight. They'd searched the Whitaker house twice in the first weeks after Emma vanished. Nothing. But that didn't mean anything now. Mark parked a block away and approached on foot, hand resting on his holstered weapon. The yard was overgrown, chain-link fence rusted and bent in places. A no trespassing sign hung crookedly on the gate. He pushed it open, wincing at the squeal of hinges. The front door was still sealed with police tape from the last search, undisturbed. Mark circled to the back, where a broken basement window had been boarded up, poorly. One of the boards was loose, enough for a slim person to squeeze through. Heart pounding, Mark pulled his flashlight and weapon simultaneously. He scanned the backyard, the beam cutting through the darkness. Something moved at the edge of the light, a shadow ducking behind the detached garage. "Police! Stop right there!" Mark called out, advancing toward the garage. "Jesus Christ, Mark," a familiar voice responded. "Put the gun down before you shoot me." Officer James Miller stepped into the flashlight beam, hands slightly raised, his face a map of concern. He was in uniform too, though his looked considerably more presentable. "Miller, what the hell are you doing here?" Mark lowered his weapon but didn't holster it. "Following you. Again." Miller approached cautiously. "I pulled your patrol car's GPS after you ignored the radio. 3rd time this week, partner. There's a light in the upstairs window. Someone's in there." Miller looked at the house, then back at Mark. "There's no light, Mark. I've been watching for 5 minutes before you spotted me." Mark turned sharply, pointing his flashlight at the window. Dark and empty. He swore under his breath. "You need to stop this," Miller said, his voice softening. "You're running yourself into the ground. When was the last time you slept? Actually slept, not passed out from exhaustion?" "I don't need a babysitter," Mark snapped. "No, you need a friend who will tell you the truth." Miller stepped closer. "This isn't helping Emma, and Tyler needs his father." The mention of his son hit Mark like a physical blow. Tyler, just 12, spending more time at friends' houses than his own home. The refrigerator empty, except for condiments and expired milk. The school counselor's calls that went unanswered. "I can't stop," Mark said, his voice cracking. "If I stop, it means I'm giving up on her." "Following proper procedure isn't giving up. Taking care of yourself and Tyler isn't giving up." Miller placed a hand on Mark's shoulder. "Chief's running out of patience. He can't keep covering for you. One more unauthorized patrol and you're on mandatory leave." Before Mark could respond, a slurred voice called from the sidewalk. "Well, if it ain't the crazy cop himself." Both officers turned to see Denny Lawson, the neighborhood drunk, swaying at the edge of the yard. Denny had been questioned early in the investigation. He lived alone in a house with a direct view of the route Emma would have taken home from Jenna's. But his alibi checked out. Security footage showed him passed out at a bar across town when Emma disappeared. "Go home, Denny," Miller called out. But Denny was already pushing through the gate. "Still looking for your girl, huh?" His breath reeked of cheap whiskey. "You're the only one who don't know the truth, officer. Dead and buried, that's what everyone's saying." Mark moved so fast that Miller had no time to intervene. In 3 strides, he crossed the yard and slammed Denny against the fence, forearm pressed against the man's throat. "Mark!" Miller shouted, rushing forward. "Say that again!" Mark hissed, his face inches from Denny's. "Say that about my daughter again." Fear broke through Denny's drunken haze. He clawed at Mark's arm, gasping for air. Miller grabbed Mark's shoulders, pulling him back with all his strength. "That's enough! Let him go!" Mark released his grip, and Denny slumped against the fence, coughing and sputtering. "You're fucking crazy," Denny wheezed, rubbing his throat. "No wonder they're taking your badge." "Get out of here before I change my mind about arresting you for public intoxication," Miller warned, positioning himself between Mark and Denny. The drunk man stumbled away, muttering obscenities as he disappeared down the dark street. "He's not worth it," Miller said, turning back to Mark, who stood rigid, fists clenched at his sides. "Come on, let's get you home." "I'm finishing my patrol," Mark said flatly. "Mark, either help me check the house or leave me alone to do my job." Miller sighed, shoulders slumping in defeat. "Fine. But we do it by the book. We call it in, request backup, and wait. No cowboy shit." Mark nodded reluctantly. As Miller pulled out his radio, something glinted in the grass near the fence. Mark crouched down, directing his flashlight at the object. It was a bracelet, a simple braided string with blue and green beads. His heart nearly stopped. Emma had been wearing a bracelet just like it the day she disappeared. He'd helped her tie it that morning, her impatient fidgeting making the task more difficult than it should have been. He picked it up carefully, rolling it between his fingers. It could be anyone's. Lots of girls made friendship bracelets like this. But here, at the Whitaker house after all this time... "Miller," he called, his voice barely audible. "Look at this." Miller knelt beside him, examining the bracelet in Mark's palm. His expression shifted from skepticism to concern. "We need to bag that," he said gently. "And call forensics." Mark nodded, a new energy coursing through him. Maybe he wasn't chasing ghosts after all. It was nearly 4 a.m. when Mark finally unlocked the door to his apartment. The bracelet had been logged into evidence, the Whitaker house searched top to bottom, again, with no further findings. But it was something. The first tangible lead in months. The apartment was dark and silent. Maps covered the living room walls, red pins marking every location searched, every person questioned. Notebooks filled with timelines and theories cluttered the coffee table. The kitchen sink overflowed with unwashed dishes. Mark tossed his keys onto the counter and headed toward Tyler's room to check on him, a habit he couldn't break, despite knowing his son often slept at friends' houses to escape the suffocating atmosphere at home. The light beneath Tyler's door surprised him. He knocked softly. "Tyler, you still up?" When no answer came, he pushed the door open. Tyler was indeed awake, but not in bed. He stood by his dresser, methodically packing clothes into a duffel bag. A larger suitcase sat by the door, already filled. "What's going on?" Mark asked, though the scene before him told the whole story. Tyler didn't look up from his packing. At 12, he already had the weary eyes of someone much older. "Grandma and Grandpa are picking me up in the morning." "For the weekend?" Mark asked, knowing the answer. "No." Tyler finally met his father's gaze. "For good. Or at least until... I don't know." Mark stepped into the room, suddenly aware of how little he'd been in this space in recent months. Tyler's basketball trophies, his science fair ribbon, the model rockets they used to build together, all gathering dust. "Tyler, we can talk about this. Whatever's bothering you." "That's just it, Dad," Tyler interrupted, zipping the duffel bag with finality. "You're never here to talk. And when you are, you're not really here, you're just somewhere else with Emma." "I'm trying to find your sister," Mark said, the familiar justification sounding hollow even to his own ears. Tyler shook his head, eyes welling with tears he refused to let fall. "I can't live like this anymore, Dad," he said, his voice breaking. "I can't stand living with a ghost." Mark stood in the empty doorway of Tyler's room, clutching the forgotten t-shirt his son had left behind. The reality of his solitude hit him like a physical blow. The house was silent in a way it had never been before. Not the peaceful quiet of a sleeping home, but the hollow emptiness of abandonment. He pressed the shirt to his face, inhaling deeply. It still smelled like Tyler's deodorant, the one he'd started using too much of since hitting puberty. Mark's chest tightened. He'd lost Emma 7 months ago, and now he'd driven away Tyler too. The shirt joined the growing pile of laundry in the corner, another task he'd neglected for too long. Mark checked his watch. 8:30 a.m. He was already late for his shift. Not that it mattered anymore. At the precinct, the usual morning bustle halted momentarily as he walked through. Conversations ceased. Colleagues averted their eyes or offered pitying glances. He'd become the department's cautionary tale, the once exemplary officer unraveled by tragedy. Chief Randall's door was open, but Mark knocked anyway. "Thompson, you're late." The chief didn't look up from his paperwork. "Close the door." Mark complied, settling into the familiar chair across from the desk. How many times had he sat here over the past 7 months? First for updates on Emma's case, then for reprimands, finally for warnings. Chief Randall slid a document across the desk, the department letterhead stark against the white paper. "This is official now, Thompson. I can't keep covering for you." Mark scanned the document, the words blurring together. Medical leave, psychological evaluation, fitness for duty assessment, required counseling. "This isn't a request," the chief said, his voice softening slightly. "Either you take the leave voluntarily, or I'll have to suspend you pending investigation into multiple violations of department protocol." Mark's fingers tightened around the paper, crumpling its edges. "The bracelet we found last night is being processed, along with everything else from the Whitaker property, by officers who aren't emotionally compromised." The chief leaned forward. "Mark, you're a good cop. One of my best, but this has gone too far. You need help." Mark stood abruptly, the chair scraping loudly against the floor. "What I need is for this department to keep looking for my daughter. We are looking, but we're doing it by the book." Chief Randall's tone hardened. "Turn in your badge and weapon before you leave today." At his locker, Mark stared at his service weapon and badge. For 15 years, they had been extensions of himself. His fingers traced the shield's contours one last time before placing them in the metal tray. Officer Jenkins, a young rookie who had joined just before Emma disappeared, paused awkwardly nearby. "I'm sorry, sir," he mumbled. "About everything." Mark nodded curtly, unable to form words of acknowledgement. The pity in Jenkins' eyes made his skin crawl. As he closed his locker, he felt the weight of stares from across the room. His colleagues, friends once, watching him with that same damnable mixture of sympathy and discomfort. He left without saying goodbye to anyone, not even Miller. Back in his apartment, the walls seemed to close in. The maps, the photos, the timelines, they screamed of his failure. 7 months of obsessive searching, and what did he have to show for it? A maybe bracelet that could belong to any teenage girl, a son who couldn't stand living with him anymore, and now, no badge. Mark's hand shook as he reached for the whiskey bottle he'd left untouched since Emma's disappearance. He'd sworn off drinking then, needing his mind sharp for the search. What was the point of that discipline now? The amber liquid burned his throat, spreading warmth through his chest. 1 glass became 2, then 3. The edges of the room softened. He moved through the apartment, staring at the evidence of his obsession. Red pins marking searched locations, yellow for witness interviews, blue for potential sightings, all leading nowhere. With a sudden burst of anger, he tore a map from the wall, then another. Papers scattered across the floor as he collapsed among them, the whiskey bottle now dangerously low. His eyes burned with unshed tears. For the first time since Emma disappeared, Mark Thompson allowed himself to consider the possibility that he might never find her. Sleep came eventually, a restless unconsciousness amid the debris of his investigation. He dreamed of Emma calling for him, her voice echoing through dark corridors that twisted endlessly. The insistent ringing of his cell phone pulled him back to reality. Mark's head throbbed as he fumbled through the papers, locating the phone beneath a fallen map. "Thompson," he answered automatically, his voice rough from sleep and alcohol. "Jesus, Mark, you sound like hell." Miller's concerned voice came through the speaker. "Have you checked your messages? I've been trying to reach you all morning." Mark squinted at the screen. 11:47 a.m. 6 missed calls, most from Miller. "What do you want, James?" His mouth tasted sour, the whiskey's aftermath coating his tongue. "It's the strangest thing," Miller said, hesitation evident in his voice. "There's this cat that keeps showing up at the station. Gray tabby, kind of scruffy looking." Mark stared at the phone in disbelief. "You're calling me about a stray cat?" "Not just any stray cat. This one's been hanging around for weeks, according to Jenkins. Always sits across the street, staring at the front entrance like it's waiting for someone. And why exactly should I care about this?" Mark pushed himself upright, grimacing as his head protested the movement. "I checked the security cameras from the past month," Miller continued, ignoring Mark's irritation. "This cat shows up almost daily. Same time, same behavior. It's weird, Mark." "Fascinating," Mark replied flatly. "Any news on the bracelet?" Miller's sigh crackled through the speaker. "Nothing conclusive yet. Look, I know it sounds crazy, but there's something about this cat that's bugging me. Jenkins says it started appearing right after Emma," Mark finished. The familiar ache intensified in his chest. "Yeah." Mark rubbed his temples. "James, I appreciate that you're trying to keep me in the loop, but I really don't have the mental bandwidth for mysterious cats right now." I know. Just keep an eye out, okay? If you see it around your place." After ending the call, Mark forced himself to shower, the hot water washing away some of the previous night's fog. The thought of facing his in-laws to see Tyler sent a fresh wave of dread through him, but he couldn't put it off. The drive to his former in-laws' suburban house felt interminable. They had never approved of him, even when Sarah was alive. After her death from cancer 4 years ago, they had reluctantly maintained a relationship for the children's sake. Emma's disappearance and his subsequent spiral had only confirmed their worst opinions. Margaret Peterson opened the door, her lips pressed into a thin line. "Mark, we weren't expecting you." "I came to see Tyler." He shifted uncomfortably on the porch. "Is he here?" She hesitated before stepping aside. "In the backyard. He's doing homework." The house was exactly as he remembered. Immaculately kept, photos of Emma and Tyler at various ages displayed prominently. He noticed they'd added several new ones of Emma. a silent memorial that made his stomach clench. Tyler sat at the patio table, math textbook open before him. He looked up as Mark approached, his expression guarded. "Hey, buddy," Mark said, attempting a smile. "Hi." Tyler's response was flat, his eyes returning to his book. Mark sat across from him, searching for words. "How's the math coming along?" Tyler shrugged. "It's fine." The conversation stuttered along painfully. Tyler answered in monosyllables, his body language screaming discomfort. Mark was about to try another approach when a flash of movement caught his eye. A gray tabby cat sat on the fence, watching them intently. Despite the rain that had started falling, the cat remained motionless, its gaze unnerving in its intensity. "That cat's been hanging around a lot," Tyler commented, following Mark's gaze. "Grandma tried to shoo it away, but it keeps coming back." Mark stared at the animal, remembering Miller's call. "How long has it been coming here?" Tyler shrugged again. "Couple weeks, maybe. It's weird. That cat shows up everywhere." He paused, a flicker of the old Tyler breaking through his defensive shell. "Emma always wanted a gray tabby, remember? She used to leave food out for the strays, hoping one would adopt us." Mark's throat tightened. "I remember." The visit ended as awkwardly as it had begun. Margaret made it clear that Tyler needed to finish his homework, and Mark couldn't find a reason to stay where he was so clearly unwelcome. As he drove away, he spotted the cat again, sitting under a streetlight, watching his car pass. The next morning, fueled by restless energy and the need to do something, Mark drove to the precinct. He wouldn't go inside, couldn't with his forced leave. But he needed to confront Donald Mercer, a man who had been questioned early in Emma's case and released for lack of evidence. Mercer worked at the auto shop across from the police station. Mark had always felt the man knew more than he admitted. The way he'd answered questions, his nervous tics, the inconsistencies in his statement, they all gnawed at Mark. He spotted Mercer taking a smoke break in the alley beside the shop. Without his badge or the constraints of protocol, Mark approached directly. "We need to talk, Mercer." The man's eyes widened in recognition. "Officer Thompson, it's just Thompson now." Mark moved closer, backing Mercer against the wall. "You lied about where you were the day Emma disappeared." "I didn't lie." Mercer's voice rose an octave. "I told you everything I know." "You said you were alone at the shop until 6. The security footage only covers the front entrance. You could have left through this very alley." Mark pressed his forearm against Mercer's chest. "What aren't you telling me?" "Get your hands off me," Mercer shoved back. "Everyone knows you've lost it, Thompson. You're not even a cop anymore." The first punch landed before Mark realized he'd thrown it. Mercer stumbled but recovered quickly, swinging wildly. They grappled against the wall, knocking over trash cans in their struggle. "Mark, stop!" Miller's voice cut through the chaos. He pulled Mark away from Mercer, positioning himself between them. "What the hell are you doing?" "He knows something," Mark panted, trying to break free from Miller's grip. "He's always known something." "I don't know anything," Mercer shouted, wiping blood from his split lip. "Your kid was taken by some sicko, and it wasn't me. I'm calling the real cops." Miller forcibly marched Mark to his car, pushing him into the passenger seat. "Have you completely lost your mind? You just assaulted a civilian in broad daylight." Mark's adrenaline ebbed, leaving him shaking. "He's hiding something. I can feel it." "What you're feeling isn't evidence." Miller leaned against the car, rain soaking his uniform. "Mark, you can't keep doing this. You're going to get yourself arrested or worse." They sat in silence, the rain hammering on the car roof. Finally, Mark spoke. "I found the same cat at my in-laws' house, the gray tabby you mentioned." Miller straightened. "You're kidding." "Tyler says it's been showing up for weeks. Said it appears everywhere." Mark looked at his former partner, and he mentioned that Emma always wanted a gray tabby. Miller's expression shifted, interest sparking in his eyes despite his skepticism. Could be coincidence. Maybe. Mark stared through the rain-streaked windshield, noticing a small gray shape across the street. There it is again. The cat sat perfectly still despite the downpour, its eyes seemingly fixed on Mark's car. When Mark stepped out into the rain, the cat stood and began walking slowly away, looking back as if to ensure it was being followed. Acting on impulse he couldn't explain, Mark pursued the animal. It led him through several blocks, always maintaining distance but clearly leading him somewhere. Miller followed in his car, keeping pace with Mark's increasingly determined stride. Following the feline out of pure frustration, Mark realized the animal was repeatedly leading him in the same direction, toward an old barn that had been only superficially checked at the beginning of the search for Emma. Mark stood motionless in the rain, staring at the old barn that loomed at the end of the dirt path. The gray tabby sat calmly at the entrance, as if it had been waiting for him all along. A day ago, he would have dismissed Miller's cat story as nonsense, a desperate attempt to keep his mind occupied. Now, he wasn't so sure. "You sure about this?" Miller called from his patrol car, window rolled down. "That barn was cleared in the first week of the investigation." "It was cleared quickly," Mark replied, his eyes never leaving the cat. "One afternoon, 4 officers, no dogs. They were looking for a recently abducted girl, not evidence of longer-term captivity." Miller sighed, turning off the engine. "I shouldn't be enabling this." The cat watched them approach, then slipped inside through a gap in the weathered wooden doors. Mark followed, aware of the absurdity of the situation. A suspended police officer following a stray cat based on nothing but coincidence and desperation. The interior was dim, dust particles dancing in the few rays of light that penetrated through gaps in the roof. Farm equipment, long abandoned, cast strange shadows across the earthen floor. Their search months ago had found nothing suspicious, just an old barn slowly decaying on the outskirts of town. The cat sat in the center of the space, watching Mark with unblinking eyes. "So, what's the theory here?" Miller asked, stepping carefully around a rusted tractor part. "This cat knows where Emma is?" Mark didn't answer immediately. He moved methodically around the barn, checking corners, examining walls, looking for anything they might have missed before. "I don't have a theory," he finally admitted. "But this cat keeps appearing in places connected to Emma. The station where her case is being handled, my in-laws' house where her brother is staying, and now here. A place we searched." He paused, running his hand along a support beam. "Tyler said Emma always wanted a gray tabby. What if she knew this cat?" "That's a lot of coincidences," Miller said, but his voice lacked conviction. Mark could tell that even the practical-minded Miller was starting to wonder. Back at his apartment, Mark carefully placed his police badge and gun in a drawer. The gesture felt final, though he knew the department had only demanded them temporarily. Without his uniform, without his son, he felt like a ghost in his own life. The next morning, Mark drove to the city library. The elderly librarian, Mrs. Patel, greeted him with the same sympathetic smile everyone gave him these days. "Officer Thompson, how can I help you today?" "Just Mark," he corrected. "I need any information you have on unusual animal behavior, specifically cats." Mrs. Patel raised an eyebrow but didn't question him. 20 minutes later, he sat at a study table surrounded by books with titles like The Mysterious Feline Mind and Animal Cognition and Behavior. Most were pseudoscientific at best, but he combed through them anyway, searching for anything that might explain the cat's behavior. 3 hours of reading yielded little beyond anecdotal stories of animals finding their way home over impossible distances or sensing dangers before humans could detect them. Nothing about cats leading humans to specific locations repeatedly. Nothing about animal intervention in missing persons cases. As Mrs. Patel approached to check on him, Mark noticed her concerned expression. He realized how he must look, unshaven, disheveled, frantically flipping through books about animal behavior while muttering to himself. Another piece of evidence for the growing town narrative. Officer Thompson has lost his mind. Back home, Mark spread a new map across his dining table. With a red marker, he circled every location where he or Miller had spotted the gray tabby: the police station, his in-laws' house, the barn. After a moment's hesitation, he added the Whitaker property where he'd found the bracelet, though he hadn't seen the cat there. When he connected the dots, he realized they formed a rough circle with the old barn near the center. Coincidence? Or something more? Mark's phone rang, Miller's name flashing on the screen. "I've been thinking about this cat situation," Miller said without preamble. "Maybe you should come to the psychological evaluation. Talk to someone professional about it." Mark's grip tightened on the phone. "You think I'm imagining things?" "I think grief makes people see patterns where there aren't any." Miller's voice was gentle. "Mark, you can come back to the force. Just follow protocol. Take the evaluation, get cleared, and help search for Emma officially." "I don't need a shrink to tell me I'm grieving," Mark snapped. "I need answers." After hanging up, Mark tried calling Tyler again. The call went straight to voicemail for the third time that day. Frustrated, he grabbed his keys and headed for Emma's school. Oak Ridge Middle School hadn't changed since Emma had attended. The same brick building, the same flagpole where he'd dropped her off countless mornings. The secretary recognized him immediately. "Mr. Thompson, we weren't expecting you." "I need to speak with Mrs. Collins, Emma's science teacher." Mrs. Collins was in her classroom grading papers. Her face registered surprise, then the familiar pity when she saw Mark. "Mr. Thompson, what can I do for you?" "I need to know if Emma's class ever took field trips to the old Miller barn on the edge of town." The question clearly caught her off guard. "The Miller barn?" "Yes, actually. We take the 7th grade environmental science class there every year. The property owner lets us study the local ecosystem." Mark's pulse quickened. "When was Emma's class there?" "Last spring, about 3 months before." She trailed off. "Before the incident." "Do you have photos? From the field trip?" Mrs. Collins hesitated, then turned to her computer. "I should. We document all field trips for the yearbook." She pulled up a folder of images, clicking through them as Mark stood anxiously behind her. There were dozens of photos, students collecting soil samples, identifying plants, posing for group shots. "There," Mark said, pointing at the screen. "That's Emma." The photo showed Emma kneeling near a small stream behind the barn, carefully filling a test tube with water. She was smiling, her ponytail caught by the wind. Mark felt a familiar ache in his chest. "Can you send me these photos?" Back at home, Mark examined every pixel of the school photos. In most, Emma was with classmates focused on their science projects. But in one background shot of the entire group, something caught his eye. At the edge of the frame, partially hidden behind a tree, was a gray shape. He zoomed in, the image becoming pixelated but still recognizable. A gray tabby cat, watching the students from a distance. The same cat. 3 months before Emma disappeared. It couldn't be coincidence. Mark printed the photo and added it to his growing collection of evidence. To an outsider, it would look like the desperate reaching of a man unhinged by grief, connecting random dots, assigning meaning to happenstance. Maybe that's all it was. But maybe, just maybe, he was onto something everyone else had missed. His phone rang again. Miller, probably with more well-intentioned advice. Mark ignored it, focusing instead on the map before him. If the cat had been at the barn before Emma disappeared, if it kept returning there had to be a reason. The next morning, Mark waited in a cafe across from the police station. Sure enough, at precisely 10:15 a.m., the gray tabby appeared, sitting on the sidewalk opposite the entrance, watching intently. It remained there for exactly 30 minutes before disappearing down an alley. Mark followed at a distance. The cat moved purposefully through town, occasionally stopping to ensure Mark was still following. It led him past the high school, through the park, and eventually toward the eastern edge of town, the direction of the barn. At a busy intersection, Mark momentarily lost sight of the animal. Frustrated, he circled the block twice before giving up. As he returned to his car, he spotted Miller leaning against it, arms crossed. "Following cats now, Mark? In broad daylight?" "You're the one who told me about it in the first place," Mark replied defensively. "As an observation, not a suggestion to launch a feline-based investigation." Miller pushed off the car. "Let's get coffee. Real coffee. Not the stakeout kind you've been drinking." In the cafe, Miller placed a manila folder on the table. Preliminary results on the bracelet. It's similar to the type Emma was wearing, but there's no conclusive evidence it's hers. No fingerprints, no DNA. It could belong to any teenage girl in town. Mark's hope deflated. But it was at the Whitaker house, which teenagers have been using as a hangout spot for years, Miller countered. "Mark, I'm saying this as your friend. You're seeing connections where there aren't any. The cat, the bracelet, the barn. You're building a conspiracy because it's easier than accepting reality." "What reality is that?" Mark's voice hardened. Miller met his gaze steadily. "That sometimes terrible things happen for no reason. That sometimes we don't get answers." Mark stood abruptly. "Thanks for the update on the bracelet." "Mark, I'll see you around, James." That night, Mark sat in his car outside the empty barn, watching. The full moon illuminated the structure, casting long shadows across the field. At exactly midnight, the gray tabby emerged from the surrounding woods, walking deliberately to the barn entrance. It sat there, staring directly at Mark's car, before disappearing inside. Taking his flashlight, Mark approached cautiously. Inside, the cat sat in the center of the dirt floor, perfectly still except for the occasional twitch of its tail. "What are you trying to show me?" Mark whispered, feeling foolish for talking to a cat, but unable to shake the feeling that the animal understood. The cat moved to a specific section of the floor and began pawing at the dirt, looking up at Mark, expectantly. For a solid hour, Mark searched the area the cat indicated, finding nothing but packed earth and the occasional rusted nail. Eventually, the cat lost interest and wandered away, leaving Mark alone with his increasingly desperate theories. On the third night of his feline-guided vigil, Mark arrived to find the empty barn illuminated by the beams of multiple flashlights. A group of teenagers scattered as he approached, dropping bottles of cheap beer in their haste to escape. "Hey!" Mark called, managing to grab one boy by the jacket. "What are you doing here?" "Nothing, man. Just hanging out." The kid was perhaps 16, his eyes wide with fear. "You're that cop, right? The one looking for his daughter?" Mark released his grip slightly. "You know about me?" The boy nodded. "Everyone knows about you. You're like a town legend now, the crazy cop who thinks his daughter was kidnapped by ghosts or whatever." "What?" "That's what people say, that you've gone mental seeing conspiracies everywhere." The boy shifted uncomfortably. "Look, we're just using the place to drink a few beers. We're not hurting anybody." "Have you seen a gray cat around here? Tabby, medium-sized?" The boy's expression confirmed Mark's growing suspicion that the entire town thought he'd lost his mind. "A cat? No, man. But there are lots of strays around here." After the teenagers left, Mark sat alone in the barn, the weight of his isolation settling over him. What if Miller was right? What if he was manufacturing connections to avoid facing the unbearable truth that Emma might never be found? Under the light of the full moon, Mark noticed something reflective in the dirt where the teenagers had been sitting. He knelt down, brushing away the soil to reveal a blue notebook cover. His heart raced as he picked it up. "Property of Emma Thompson" was written across the front, in his daughter's familiar handwriting, decorated with star stickers in the corners. His hands trembled as he flipped through the pages. Science notes, drawings of plants, a pressed leaf. Dates from last spring, exactly when her class had visited the barn. Reality crashed down around him. The notebook wasn't evidence of Emma's captivity. It was simply something she'd lost during the school field trip months before her disappearance. The cat, the bracelet, the barn, none of it connected to her abduction. He'd been chasing shadows, constructing an elaborate fantasy, rather than accepting the devastating simplicity of random tragedy. Under the light fraca da lanterna, Mark afastou as tábuas soltas que o gato havia indicado com suas garras, revelando sinais inconfundíveis de porão oculto embaixo do velho celeiro. Mark's hands trembled as he moved the loose floorboards that the cat had been scratching at. The beam of his flashlight revealed unmistakable signs of a hidden cellar beneath the old barn. Years of police work had taught him to recognize the deliberate construction of concealed spaces, and this was undoubtedly one of them. The exposed section revealed wooden supports forming a crude passageway downward. A rusted metal handle was embedded in what appeared to be a trapdoor, long covered by dirt and hay but now partially visible thanks to the cat's persistent scratching. "What the hell?" Mark whispered, his pulse quickening. He aimed his flashlight into the narrow opening, but couldn't see much beyond the first few steps of a makeshift ladder. The gray tabby watched from a few feet away, its eyes reflecting the flashlight beam in an eerie green glow. For a moment, Mark felt an irrational surge of gratitude toward the animal. Maybe he wasn't losing his mind after all. Maybe this strange cat really had been trying to show him something. Mark gripped the rusted handle and pulled. The trapdoor resisted at first, then gave way with a groan of ancient hinges. Stale air rushed upward, carrying the unmistakable musty scent of an enclosed space, long untouched by fresh air. Mark aimed his flashlight down the opening, revealing a narrow set of wooden steps descending into darkness. In his haste to investigate, Mark had left his phone in the car. No backup, no weapon, not even the ability to call for help if needed. The rational part of his brain, the trained police officer, warned him to retreat, to call Miller, to do this by the book. But the desperate father in him couldn't wait another minute. The wooden steps creaked ominously as Mark descended into the cellar. The space was small, perhaps 10 feet square, with a dirt floor and roughly finished walls. His flashlight beam swept the perimeter, revealing an assortment of junk: empty bottles, a stained mattress on the floor, a stack of yellowed magazines, a broken chair, and then a flash of blue caught in the light. Mark rushed forward, kneeling beside a pile of debris in the corner. He brushed aside old newspapers and empty food wrappers to reveal a blue school notebook. His hands shook violently as he picked it up, aiming the flashlight at the cover. "Property of Emma Thompson" was written in neat handwriting across the front, adorned with colorful pen doodles and stickers in the corners, Emma's distinctive style. Mark's breath caught in his throat. After 7 months of searching, here was tangible evidence that his daughter had been here, in this hidden cellar. With trembling fingers, he opened the notebook, desperate for information, for dates, for anything that might tell him if Emma had written in it after her disappearance. The pages contained the familiar sight of his daughter's handwriting: science notes, occasional doodles in the margins, lists of homework assignments. He was so engrossed in examining the notebook that he almost missed the sound of footsteps above. Mark quickly turned off the flashlight, plunging the cellar into darkness. He listened intently as the footsteps moved across the barn floor directly overhead. Not the light steps of the cat, but the deliberate movement of a person trying to be quiet. Mark pressed himself against the wall beside the stairs, heart hammering in his chest. He had no weapon, no backup, and no official standing as a police officer anymore. If this was Emma's abductor returning to the scene, he was dangerously unprepared. The footsteps stopped just above the open trapdoor. A beam of light shone down into the cellar, scanning the space. Mark held his breath, waiting for the intruder to descend. When the figure began climbing down the ladder, Mark coiled his muscles, ready to strike. He wouldn't get a second chance. As soon as the intruder reached the bottom step, Mark lunged forward, tackling the figure to the dirt floor. They struggled in the darkness, grunting and thrashing. The intruder was younger and more agile than Mark had expected. A flashlight rolled across the floor, its beam creating wild, spinning shadows as they fought. Mark managed to pin the intruder face down, twisting one arm behind their back in a standard police restraint. "Don't move!" Mark shouted, using his free hand to grab the fallen flashlight. He directed the beam at the intruder's face as he roughly flipped them over. The light revealed not a hardened criminal, but the terrified face of a teenage boy, no more than 16 or 17. The same boy Mark had confronted with the group of teenagers earlier. "Get off me, man!" the boy shouted, struggling against Mark's grip. "You're hurting me!" Mark eased the pressure slightly but maintained his hold. "What are you doing back here? Who are you?" Jason Reeves. I live on Maple Street." The boy's voice cracked with fear. "Please don't hurt me." "Why did you come back?" Mark demanded, aiming the flashlight directly at Jason's face. "I forgot my backpack," Jason stammered. "My weed was in it. My parents would kill me if they found out. I wasn't doing anything wrong." Mark finally released his grip, sitting back on his heels as the adrenaline ebbed from his system. The boy scrambled to his feet, pressing himself against the far wall of the cellar, eyes wide with terror. "You're that cop, aren't you? The one whose kid disappeared?" Jason's voice trembled. "Everyone says you've gone crazy." Mark held up the blue notebook. "My daughter was here. This is her notebook." Jason squinted at the notebook, then looked back at Mark with a mixture of pity and fear. "That thing, it's like ancient, man. The middle school brings kids here every year for science class. They study plants and bugs and stuff." "This could have been left recently," Mark insisted, though doubt was already creeping into his mind. "No way," Jason shook his head. "This cellar's been our hangout spot since like forever. Me and my friends come here to get high. That notebook's been here for months, way before your daughter went missing." Mark flipped through the pages again, more carefully this time. The last dated entry was from April, 3 months before Emma's disappearance. His momentary hope crumbled, leaving only the familiar ache of disappointment. "Everyone in town knows about you," Jason continued, seemingly emboldened now that Mark no longer appeared threatening. "You're like the town legend now. The crazy cop obsessed with conspiracy theories about his missing kid." The words hit Mark like physical blows. "I'm not crazy," he said quietly, more to himself than to Jason. "I'm trying to find my daughter. Look, I'm sorry about your kid. That really sucks." Jason's tone softened slightly. "But this is just an old cellar where teenagers hang out. There's nothing weird here except you, following cats and attacking people." Mark sat heavily on the bottom step, the notebook still clutched in his hands. The boy was right. He'd constructed an elaborate fantasy around a stray cat, a lost bracelet, and his daughter's old school notebook. He'd been so desperate for connections, for any thread that might lead to Emma, that he'd lost all perspective. "There's your backpack," Mark said dully, pointing to a black bag partly hidden beneath the broken chair. "Take it and go." Jason hesitated, then darted forward to grab his backpack. He paused at the foot of the stairs, looking back at Mark with an expression that mingled pity with genuine concern. "You should go home, mister. Get some help or something." After the boy left, Mark remained seated on the cellar steps, turning Emma's notebook over in his hands. The dim light of his flashlight illuminated the cheerful cover with its stars and doodles, a painful reminder of his daughter's normal, happy life before she vanished. What had he been thinking? That a mysterious cat would lead him to Emma when an entire police department couldn't find her? That he alone would uncover some conspiracy that everyone else had missed? the reality was far simpler and more devastating. Emma was gone, and 7 months of obsessive searching had yielded nothing but the destruction of what remained of his family. Mark climbed out of the cellar, closing the trap door behind him. In the barn above, the gray tabby still sat watching him, its unwavering gaze following his movements. "There's nothing here," Mark said aloud to the cat. "She's not here. You're just a stray cat, and I'm just a man who's lost everything." The cat blinked once, then turned and slipped out through a gap in the barn wall, disappearing into the night. Back in his car, Mark stared at Emma's notebook on the passenger seat. His last tenuous connection to hope had been severed. All this time, he'd been chasing ghosts, constructing an elaborate fantasy, rather than facing the devastating simplicity of his loss. He drove home in silence, the weight of reality pressing down on him like a physical force. The walls of his apartment, covered with maps and theories and photos, now seemed like the desperate decorations of a deranged mind. Each red pin, each scribbled note, each string connecting unrelated events. All evidence not of a conspiracy surrounding Emma's disappearance, but of his own unraveling sanity. Mark began methodically removing the maps and photos from the walls. Each one represented a dead end, a false hope, a theory abandoned. He carefully folded a photograph of Emma, the last one taken before her disappearance, and placed it in his wallet rather than back on the wall. Not evidence anymore, just a memory to carry. As he cleared away the physical manifestations of his obsession, Mark confronted the truth he'd been avoiding for months. He had lost not only Emma, but everything else that mattered. His job, his dignity, and now Tyler, all sacrificed on the altar of a search that had consumed him entirely. Back in the empty apartment, Mark stared at the walls covered with theories and maps, feeling the crushing weight of reality. Perhaps he had lost not only Emma, but also his sanity, his job, and now his son Tyler. Mark methodically tore the maps and photos from the walls, each one representing an abandoned theory, a false hope, a dead end. The sound of paper ripping filled the silent apartment as 7 months of obsessive investigation came down piece by piece. Red pins clattered to the floor, yellow sticky notes with hastily scribbled leads crumpled in his fist. He paused, holding a photo of Emma from her last birthday. 13, braces gleaming, eyes bright with the promise of life ahead. Unlike the others, he couldn't bring himself to crumple this one. Instead, he carefully folded it and placed it in his wallet. Not evidence anymore, just a memory to carry. By dawn, the living room walls were bare except for the faint outlines where tape had pulled at the paint. The dining table, once covered with timelines and witness statements, was clear. The corkboard that had held his primary suspects now leaned empty against the wall, waiting to be discarded. Mark sat on the couch, surrounded by trash bags filled with the physical remnants of his obsession. His hands were raw from the work, his eyes burning from lack of sleep. For the first time since Emma disappeared, his apartment no longer resembled an investigation room. It just looked empty. He picked up his phone, staring at Tyler's contact information. What would he say to his son? That he was finally ready to be a father again? That he was done chasing ghosts? The words seemed hollow, even in his mind. Mark rehearsed the conversation in his head as he sat on Tyler's bed, phone clutched in his hand. The room still smelled faintly of his son's deodorant and the laundry detergent Margaret insisted on using. Baseball trophies gathered dust on the shelf, the model rockets they'd built together still hanging from the ceiling. Life interrupted. After 5 attempts to formulate the right opening words, Mark finally pressed the call button. It rang 3 times before his mother-in-law answered. "Margaret, it's Mark. I'd like to speak with Tyler, please." A pause. "He's doing his homework right now, Mark." "It's important. I won't take much of his time." He heard muffled voices, Margaret's hand obviously covering the receiver. He caught fragments. Your father. And might not be the best time. When Margaret returned to the phone, her voice was carefully measured. Tyler's having a good day, Mark. The counselor says consistency is important right now. Perhaps you could call tomorrow during his free time. Mark closed his eyes, absorbing the blow. Just tell him I called, tell him. His voice caught. Tell him I'm making some changes. Things will be different. I'll tell him. Goodbye, Mark. The line went dead. Mark sat motionless, phone still pressed to his ear, listening to nothing. He'd lost his son, too. Not to a mysterious abduction, but to his own obsession. Tyler had needed his father, and Mark had been chasing shadows instead. The defeated silence of the apartment pressed in on him. Without the maps and theories to focus on, without Tyler, without Emma, Mark had nothing left. He found himself in the kitchen, staring at the whiskey bottle he'd opened the night before. Hair of the dog, they called it. A fitting remedy for a man who'd become a ghost in his own life. The first glass burned going down. The second was easier. By the third, the apartment didn't seem quite so empty anymore, the silence not quite so accusing. Mark was halfway through his fourth glass when someone pounded on his door. He ignored it at first, assuming it was another well-meaning colleague or neighbor with casseroles and platitudes. The pounding continued, more insistent. Mark, open up! It's Miller! Reluctantly, Mark made his way to the door, whiskey glass still in hand. He opened it to find Miller standing there, breathless, his expression a mix of excitement and urgency. You need to come with me, now. Miller took in Mark's disheveled appearance and the glass in his hand. Are you drunk? Getting there, Mark admitted. Why are you here, James? I brought a search team with dogs to the barn. You need to see what they found. Mark leaned against the doorframe. There's nothing at that barn except teenagers getting high and my daughter's old science notebook. I've been down that road. Not where you were looking, Miller insisted. I kept following that cat after you gave up. It led me to another part of the barn, a section we never properly searched. The dogs picked up something underneath the floorboards, something that wasn't there during the initial investigation. Mark stared at his former partner, trying to process what he was hearing through the fog of alcohol and exhaustion. What are you saying? I'm saying get your coat and come with me right now. This isn't a drill, Mark. The drive to the barn was a blur. Mark sat in Miller's passenger seat, the world outside smearing past as his partner broke every speed limit. The effects of the whiskey still dulled his senses, but adrenaline was quickly burning through the haze. After you mentioned the cat again, I decided to check it out myself, Miller explained as he drove. Felt like I owed it to you, after everything. I followed it around for 3 days, felt like a complete idiot chasing a stray animal. Join the club, Mark muttered. But then yesterday it kept going to this one specific corner of the barn, not where you found the notebook, a different section entirely. Kept scratching at the wall, not the floor, meowing like crazy. Mark straightened in his seat. And I brought in Peterson with his K9 unit this morning. Unofficially off the books. The dogs went nuts at that exact same spot. We pulled back some loose boards and found a second cellar entrance, one that wasn't on any of the building plans, one that definitely wasn't there when we did the initial search of the property. Hope, that treacherous emotion Mark had just purged from his system, began to seep back in. He fought against it, remembering the crushing disappointment of the notebook, the teenager's pitying expression, the realization of his own delusion. It could be nothing, Mark said, more to himself than to Miller. Another false lead. Miller's knuckles whitened on the steering wheel. It's not nothing. We found something down there, Mark, something recent. The property came into view, now transformed from an abandoned barn into an active crime scene. Police cruisers, an evidence van, and an ambulance were parked haphazardly around the structure. Floodlights had been set up despite the early evening sun, illuminating the weathered wood in harsh detail. Mark was out of the car before Miller fully stopped, running toward the barn. Chief Randall stood at the entrance, his face grim but determined. When he spotted Mark, he stepped forward. "Thompson, Miller filled you in?" Mark nodded, unable to form words past the lump in his throat. "We're proceeding carefully. Evidence team is still processing the scene." The chief's tone softened slightly. "I want to be clear. We don't know exactly what we're dealing with yet." Mark pushed past him into the barn. The interior was now brightly lit with portable work lights. Officers and crime scene technicians moved with purposeful efficiency around a section of flooring that had been pulled up in the northwest corner. Not where Mark had found the notebook, but on the opposite side of the structure. A rectangular opening in the floor revealed a set of crude wooden stairs descending into darkness. Unlike the small cellar Mark had discovered, this appeared to be a larger, more deliberately constructed space. Miller appeared at his side. "The building inspector says this addition doesn't appear on any permits or plans. It was built sometime in the last year, hidden beneath newer flooring that matched the old." Mark moved toward the opening, but a crime scene technician blocked his path. "Sorry, sir. We're still processing, no contamination." "That's my daughter down there," Mark said, his voice barely above a whisper. "We don't know that yet," the technician responded gently. "Please let us do our jobs." Time stretched unbearably as Mark watched the methodical work of the evidence team. Photographs, measurements, evidence markers placed with painstaking precision. Each minute felt like an eternity, each careful procedure an unnecessary delay. Finally, Chief Randall approached him. "They're ready for a controlled entry. Given the circumstances, I'm allowing you to accompany the team, but you follow every instruction without question. Understood?" Mark nodded, his mouth too dry for speech. The descent into the hidden cellar seemed to take forever. Each step down the crude wooden stairs brought a new wave of anxiety and hope crashing over Mark. The space below was larger than he expected, perhaps 15 feet square, with rough concrete walls and a dirt floor. Battery-powered lanterns illuminated the sparse contents: a thin mattress in one corner, a bucket, some empty food containers. A small ventilation pipe ran up through one wall, explaining how anyone could survive in the enclosed space. And then, a sound. Faint, but unmistakable. A voice calling weakly from a darkened corner beyond the lantern light. Mark stood paralyzed in the entrance of the new passage, his heart hammering in his chest as he heard something he didn't believe was possible. A weak, familiar voice calling for help from the depths of the newly discovered cellar. Mark couldn't move. The familiar voice, echoing weakly from the darkness, rooted him to the spot as officers rushed past. Time seemed to slow as flashlight beams cut through the gloom, illuminating the far corner of the cellar. "Emma," he whispered, afraid that speaking her name might shatter what could be a hallucination. "We need the medics down here now," an officer shouted into his radio, his voice sounding distant to Mark's ears. Mark forced himself forward, pushing past the evidence technicians despite their protests. When the flashlights converged on the corner, he saw her, pale and thin, huddled against the wall, blinking against the sudden light. Her hair was matted, her clothes filthy, but her eyes, Emma's eyes, widened with recognition. "Dad?" Her voice was barely audible, cracked from disuse. For one eternal second, Mark stood frozen, unable to believe what he was seeing. 7 months of desperate searching, of gradual loss of hope, of questioning his own sanity. And here she was, alive. He rushed forward, dropping to his knees before her. His hands hovered inches from her, suddenly afraid that touching her might prove she wasn't real. "Emma," he breathed. "Emma." Her thin arms reached for him with surprising strength, wrapping around his neck as she buried her face against his shoulder. Mark enfolded her gently, feeling the bones of her spine pressing against her skin, the tremors running through her body. "I knew you wouldn't give up," she whispered against his neck, her tears dampening his shirt. "I knew you'd find me." The paramedics descended the stairs with equipment and a stretcher, their urgent professionalism cutting through Mark's daze. A female paramedic gently touched his shoulder. "Sir, we need to examine her now," she said, her voice kind but firm. Mark reluctantly loosened his hold, but Emma clutched his hand with surprising force. "Don't leave," she pleaded, panic flashing in her eyes. "Don't let go." "I'm not going anywhere," Mark promised, shifting slightly to allow the paramedics access while maintaining his grip on Emma's hand. Not ever again. The paramedics worked efficiently, checking vital signs, shining a penlight in Emma's eyes, asking her simple questions that she answered in monosyllables, never releasing her grip on her father's hand. They fitted an oxygen mask over her face and started an IV line to begin rehydration. When they tried to transfer her to the stretcher, Emma's panic returned. No, I can walk. Please let me walk out." The lead paramedic exchanged glances with Mark. "It's not recommended." "Please," Emma begged through the oxygen mask. "I need to walk out of here." Understanding flooded through Mark. After months trapped in this hole, being carried out on a stretcher would be a final indignity. "Let me help her," he said to the paramedic. "Just to the ambulance." The climb up the stairs was slow and painful. Emma leaned heavily on Mark, her legs weak from confinement, but determination radiated from her thin frame. When they emerged into the barn proper, officers and technicians stood in respectful silence, many blinking back tears at the sight of the girl they'd searched for across 7 months, and the father who'd never stopped believing. Outside, the evening sun cast long shadows across the property. Emma paused at the barn door, momentarily overwhelmed by the open sky, the fresh air, the space that stretched endlessly around her. "It's okay," Mark murmured, supporting her weight. "I've got you." As they approached the ambulance, flashbulbs popped in the distance. News crews, somehow already alerted to the discovery. Mark instinctively moved to shield Emma from their lenses, using his body as a barrier between his daughter and their invasive attention. The paramedics helped Emma onto the gurney inside the ambulance. Only when the doors closed, sealing them in privacy, did Emma finally release Mark's hand, letting the medical team continue their work as they raced toward Mercy General Hospital. In the antiseptic brightness of the emergency room, doctors and nurses swarmed around Emma, checking for injuries, drawing blood, asking questions that soon overwhelmed her. Mark stayed at her side, translating the medical jargon, reassuring her when procedures became frightening. "She's severely malnourished and dehydrated," the attending physician explained to Mark in lowered tones, while a nurse took Emma's blood pressure. "But remarkably, there are no major physical injuries, no broken bones, no significant tissue damage. Whoever held her captive wanted her alive and relatively unharmed." The implications of those words sent a chill through Mark. "What about other types of trauma?" he asked, unable to voice his deepest fear. The doctor's expression softened with understanding. "We'll conduct a full examination with her consent. We have specialists for that. But right now, let's focus on stabilizing her physically." Hour after hour, test after test, Emma endured the medical marathon with quiet stoicism, answering questions when she could, falling silent when memories became too painful. Mark never left her side, even when the doctors suggested he take a break. "I'm not leaving her," he said simply, and no one argued further. When they finally settled Emma in a private room on the pediatric floor, the adrenaline that had sustained Mark began to ebb, leaving him lightheaded with exhaustion and relief. Emma lay in the hospital bed, an IV dripping fluids into her arm, her face finally peaceful in sleep. Miller appeared in the doorway, his expression a mixture of jubilation and professional restraint. "They told me I'd find you here," he said softly, mindful of Emma's sleep. Mark stepped into the hallway, keeping the door ajar to maintain sight of Emma. "How is she?" Miller asked. Physically, better than they expected. Emotionally, Mark ran a hand through his hair. It's too soon to tell. Mark, this is... Miller struggled for words. It's a miracle. In all my years on the force, I've never seen a case like this end this way. Have they found him? The kidnapper? Miller's expression turned grim. No sign yet. The cellar was empty when she was found. Apparently had been for days. Emma told the officers who took her initial statement that he fled suddenly, seemed spooked by something, left her locked down there. If he hadn't... Mark couldn't complete the thought. If the kidnapper hadn't fled, if the cat hadn't led them there, if Miller hadn't followed up. We'll find him, Miller promised. Every officer in 3 counties is looking. He can't have gone far. A soft cry from the room drew Mark back to Emma's bedside. She had awakened, momentarily disoriented by the unfamiliar surroundings. It's okay, I'm here, Mark soothed, taking her hand. You're safe in the hospital. Emma's breathing slowed as recognition replaced panic. I thought maybe I'd dreamed it, she whispered. Being found. It's real, Mark assured her. You're really here. A commotion in the hallway drew their attention. Mark looked up to see Tyler burst through the door, his grandparents hurrying behind him. The boy froze at the sight of his sister, his face a canvas of disbelief and hope. Emma? Tyler's voice cracked, the single word carrying months of grief. Emma's smile trembled on her lips. Hey, Squirt. Tyler rushed to the bed, hesitating just before touching her, suddenly aware of the IV lines and her fragile appearance. It's okay, Emma said softly. I won't break. Brother and sister embraced, both crying now, while Mark watched through his own tears. Margaret and Howard stood in the doorway, shock etched on their features. How? Margaret finally managed, looking to Mark for explanation. Later, Mark said, unwilling to discuss the details in front of Emma and Tyler. She's going to be okay. That's what matters now. The night passed in a blur of medical checks, quiet conversations, and moments of unexpected normalcy as Tyler regaled Emma with school stories, carefully avoiding any mention of her captivity. The grandparents eventually took Tyler to the cafeteria, leaving Mark alone with Emma again. Dad? Emma's voice was stronger now, the IV fluids beginning to restore her strength. How did you find me? How did you know about the cat? Mark hesitated, unsure how to explain the strange series of events that had led to her rescue. What cat, sweetheart? Emma's eyes grew distant. There was a gray tabby. It started coming to the little window near the ceiling, the only place I could see outside. It was the only living thing I saw besides... him. She shuddered slightly. I used to feed it bits of my food through the window grate. It was the only friend I had there. Mark stared at her, pieces clicking into place. You knew this cat before? Before everything happened? Emma nodded slowly. I used to feed it on my way home from school sometimes. It lived near the park. I called it Shadow because it would follow me. Her brow furrowed. How did you know about the cat? It led us to you, Mark said simply, still processing the connection. It kept appearing at the police station, at your grandparents' house, finally at the barn. Miller followed it and found the hidden cellar. Emma's eyes widened. It was trying to help me? That sounds crazy. I thought so too, Mark admitted. Everyone did. I almost gave up on following it. But you didn't, Emma said, her faith in him unwavering. Mark couldn't bring himself to tell her how close he'd come to abandoning the search, how he'd torn down all the maps and photos just hours before her rescue, how he'd almost surrendered to despair and whiskey. Miller returned with news that the search for the kidnapper was expanding. We've identified him from Emma's description. Edward Garner, 58, lives alone on the outskirts of town. Worked maintenance at the school district until 3 years ago. No criminal record, barely any record at all. Neighbors hardly knew he existed. doesn't matter," Mark said. "We'll find him." Later, when Emma had drifted back to sleep, the doctors came with their preliminary findings. She's suffering from malnutrition, vitamin D deficiency, muscle atrophy, all consistent with long-term confinement. But there's no evidence of sexual assault or severe physical abuse. From a physiological standpoint, with proper nutrition and care, she could make a full recovery. "And psychologically?" Mark asked. The doctor's expression grew more guarded. "That's harder to predict. She's experienced severe trauma, isolation, emotional abuse. Recovery will take time, and she'll need extensive support." He placed a hand on Mark's shoulder. "But she has you. That's a tremendous advantage." In the quiet of the hospital room, Mark watched Emma sleep. Her face, thinner now but still his daughter's face, peaceful in repose. The miracle he'd never stopped hoping for, even when logic and evidence and everyone around him suggested hope was futile. Outside the window, a familiar gray shape leapt onto the ledge. The tabby cat sat watching them through the glass, its yellow eyes seeming to glow in the reflection of the hospital lights. "Thank you," Mark whispered to the creature, feeling slightly foolish but overwhelmingly grateful. The cat blinked once, slowly, then disappeared into the night. On the eve of finally bringing Emma home, Mark received the call he'd been dreading. The kidnapper had been found dead in a distant cabin, taking with him to the grave the reasons for the abduction and leaving Emma with only unanswered questions. Mark sat beside Emma's hospital bed, his daughter's question hanging in the air between them. How did he know to follow the cat? How had he found her when everyone else had given up? "It wasn't me who found the cat, Emma," he finally said, his voice quiet in the sterile hospital room. "It was the cat that found me, and I almost didn't listen." Emma studied her father's face, noting the new lines etched around his eyes, the gray threading through his hair that hadn't been there 7 months ago. "Tell me what happened," she whispered. Mark hesitated, unsure how to explain his obsession, his near breakdown, the way he'd almost lost everything in his desperate search. How could he tell her that? In his darkest moment, he'd nearly given up. "Dad," Emma said softly, reaching for his hand with fingers still too thin, too pale. "I want to know everything." Before Mark could answer, a memory surfaced in Emma's eyes. She looked away toward the window where sunlight streamed through the blinds. "The first few weeks were the worst," she began, her voice distant. "He kept me blindfolded at first. I couldn't see anything, couldn't tell where I was." Her fingers twisted in the hospital blanket. "The only way I knew day from night was when he'd bring food." Mark's throat tightened, but he remained silent, letting Emma speak at her own pace. "After a while, maybe a month, he moved me to that cellar. There was a tiny window just a few inches wide near the ceiling. Too small to escape through, but I could see a patch of sky." A ghost of a smile touched her lips. "And then one day, this gray cat appeared, looking down at me." The memory played out in Emma's mind. The cold cellar, the despair that had become her constant companion, and then the sudden shock of seeing something alive, something free. The cat's curious face peering through the narrow window, whiskers twitching. "I had a piece of stale bread," Emma continued. "I tore off a little bit and pushed it through the grate. The cat ate it and just stayed there, watching me." Her eyes glistened with tears. "It was the first time since being taken that I felt like someone saw me, really saw me." Mark thought of the countless times he'd spotted the cat watching him, outside the police station, at his in-laws' house, by the barn. Had it been trying to communicate all along? "The cat started coming every day," Emma said. "I'd save bits of food for it even when I was hungry. It was worth it, just to have something to look forward to." She paused, her brow furrowing. "Do you think it knew? That it was trying to find help?" Mark squeezed her hand gently. "I don't know, sweetheart. But it led us right to you, so I'm inclined to believe it knew exactly what it was doing." A knock at the door interrupted them. The psychologist assigned to Emma's case entered with a gentle smile. "Good morning, Emma. I'm Dr. Winters. Do you feel up to talking for a little while?" After Emma nodded, Mark reluctantly left the room, promising to return soon. In the hallway, he found Tyler sitting with his grandparents, the boy's face drawn with worry. "Is she okay?" Tyler asked immediately. "She's tough," Mark said, settling into the chair beside his son. "Tougher than any of us knew." Margaret, who had been cool and distant since Mark's arrival at the hospital, spoke up. "The doctors say she can come home tomorrow if the final tests look good." Home. The word hung in the air between them. Where was home now? The apartment where Mark had spiraled into obsession? His in-laws' house where Tyler had taken refuge? "I've been cleaning up the apartment," Mark said carefully, "getting it ready for both of them." Howard cleared his throat. "Mark, we think Tyler should stay with us a while longer until things stabilize." Mark felt the familiar sting of failure, but nodded. "That's probably best. Emma will need time to adjust, and I don't want either of them feeling overwhelmed." Tyler looked between the adults, frustration evident on his face. "Don't I get a say in this? Emma's coming home. I want to be there too." Before anyone could respond, Miller appeared at the end of the hallway, his expression grave. Mark excused himself and met his partner halfway. "What's wrong?" Mark asked, immediately alert. "The news about Garner," Miller said quietly. "It's all over town. The press is having a field day with it." Mark rubbed his temples, feeling a headache building. "What are they saying?" "That he was found dead in a hunting cabin near the state line. Self-inflicted gunshot wound." Miller glanced toward Emma's room. "They're also connecting him to at least 2 other missing children cases from neighboring counties over the past decade." The implications hit Mark like a physical blow. Emma could have been just one in a series of victims. She could have disappeared forever, like the others might have. "Have they found any remains?" Mark could barely voice the question. "Not yet. Search teams are combing the area around the cabin." Miller placed a hand on Mark's shoulder. "Mark, this is going to be hard on Emma when she finds out. The questions about why he took her specifically, what happened to the others. She may never get answers now." Mark nodded, already dreading the conversation. "I'll tell her when the time is right. After she's home. After she's had some time to feel safe again." Back in Emma's room after the psychologist left, Mark found his daughter sitting up in bed, looking out the window with a distant expression. "The doctor says I can go home tomorrow," she said without turning. "That's great news, sweetheart." "Is Tyler coming home too?" There was vulnerability in the question that broke Mark's heart. "He's staying with Grandma and Grandpa for a little while longer," Mark explained gently. "But he'll visit every day. He can't wait to show you all the video games he's mastered while you were gone." Emma nodded, then asked the question Mark had been dreading. "Did they find him? The man who took me?" Mark sat on the edge of the bed, choosing his words carefully. "Yes, they found him in a cabin far from here." "Is he in jail?" Mark took her hand. "No, Emma, he's dead. He took his own life before the police could arrest him." He watched the news register on his daughter's face, not shock or grief, but a complex mixture of relief and frustration. "He said he would come back for me," she whispered. "The last time I saw him, he was agitated, talking to himself. Said he needed to go away for a while, but that he'd be back." A shudder ran through her thin frame. "I was so afraid he'd return before you found me." Mark pulled her gently into his arms, mindful of the IV still attached to her arm. "He can never hurt you again, Emma. Never." She leaned into his embrace, silent tears soaking into his shirt. "But now I'll never know why. Why me? What did I do?" "You did nothing," Mark said firmly. "Nothing. This wasn't your fault. It was just a terrible, random act by a disturbed person. Later that afternoon, Tyler was allowed to visit alone while Mark met with the medical team to discuss Emma's discharge plan. The siblings' relationship, strained by circumstances beyond their control, began its tentative healing as Tyler filled the hospital room with stories of school, friends, and the mundane details of life that Emma had missed. Mark returned to find them huddled together over Tyler's phone, looking at photos of classmates and events from the past 7 months. Something in his chest loosened at the sight, a small piece of normalcy reclaimed. That night, after Tyler and his grandparents had left and Emma had fallen into an uneasy sleep, Mark stood at the window of her hospital room. The gray tabby appeared on the ledge outside, as if keeping vigil. "Thank you," Mark whispered to the animal. "I don't understand it, but thank you." The cat blinked slowly, then turned its attention to Emma, watching her with unblinking yellow eyes. Mark's phone vibrated with a text from Miller. Security cameras picked up Guardian again, still watching the hospital entrance. Guardian. The name Tyler had given the cat felt right somehow. A protector when they had all failed. Morning brought the final preparations for Emma's discharge. As she changed into clothes Margaret had brought, new ones as she'd outgrown everything from before, Mark noticed her speaking softly to someone through the window. "Are you talking to the cat?" he asked, approaching cautiously. Emma nodded, not embarrassed. "I'm asking if he'll let me know if they come back." Mark's heart sank. "If who comes back, sweetheart?" "The other men." Emma's voice was matter-of-fact, her eyes fixed on the cat outside. "He said they would come for me if anything happened to him." The blood drained from Mark's face as he processed what she was saying. "What other men, Emma?" "The ones he talked to on the phone sometimes." Emma turned to face her father, her expression unnervingly calm. "He said they were his friends, that they had an arrangement, that if something happened to him, they would come for me." She wrapped her arms around herself. "That's why I asked Guardian to watch for them. He'll warn us, won't he?" Mark's mind raced through the implications. Had Garner been working with accomplices? Was Emma still in danger? Or were these just threats designed to keep a captive girl from attempting escape? 6 weeks after the rescue, Miller appeared at the door with an expression that Mark knew well. The investigation of the kidnapper's belongings had revealed photos of other children, including some who were still missing, suggesting he had not acted alone. Mark held the phone with trembling hands, absorbing the news Miller had just delivered. Photos of other children found among Garner's possessions, some still missing, some cases years old. The implication was clear. Emma hadn't been his only victim, and more disturbingly, he might not have worked alone. "We need protection," Mark said immediately. "If there are accomplices out there—" "Already arranged," Miller replied, his expression grim. "There'll be an unmarked car outside your apartment around the clock, plus regular patrols. We're not taking any chances." Mark pocketed his phone, taking a deep breath before entering Emma's hospital room, where she was being prepared for discharge. He painted on a smile, determined not to let his fear show. "Ready to go home, sweetheart?" Emma nodded, sitting in the wheelchair that hospital protocol required, despite her protests that she could walk. She looked small in the new clothes Margaret had brought, jeans that hung loosely on her still thin frame, a sweater a size too large that she seemed to find comfort in. "Is Tyler coming to see us tonight?" she asked, her voice stronger than it had been days before. "Of course. He wouldn't miss your first night home." Mark squeezed her shoulder gently. "He's even helping set up your room." The discharge process seemed interminable. Forms to sign, prescriptions to fill, follow-up appointments to schedule. When they finally emerged from the hospital, Emma tensed at the sight of news vans parked across the street, cameras with telephoto lenses pointed in their direction. "Dad." Her voice wavered. "It's okay," Mark assured her, positioning himself between Emma and the cameras. "Look straight ahead. Don't acknowledge them. Officer Wilson is bringing the car right to the entrance." Emma gripped the armrests of the wheelchair tightly as they waited. Mark spotted a gray shape slinking along the hospital garden wall. Guardian, keeping watch as always. The drive home was silent, Emma staring out the window at a world that must have seemed simultaneously familiar and alien. 7 months had changed little in their suburban landscape, yet everything was different now. When they reached the apartment building, Emma paused at the entrance, drawing a deep breath before stepping inside. Mark recognized the moment for what it was, a threshold between captivity and freedom, between fear and the long journey toward healing. The apartment had been transformed. Gone were the maps and photos that had cluttered every surface during Mark's obsessive search. The walls were freshly painted, the floors cleaned, even the furniture rearranged to create a sense of newness. Tyler was waiting inside, nervously shifting his weight from foot to foot. "I put your favorite posters back up," he blurted when Emma entered. "And Grandma helped me get new bedding, because she said you probably outgrew the old stuff." Emma stood in the center of the living room, taking in the familiar yet different space. Her fingers trailed over the back of the couch, the edge of the bookshelf, reacquainting herself with the textures of home. "Can I see my room?" she asked softly. Tyler led the way, eager to show the changes he'd made. Mark followed a step behind, watching as Emma paused in the doorway of her bedroom. Tyler had been careful to keep her space recognizable, the same arrangement of furniture, the same posters of bands she'd loved, while updating little things that acknowledged the passage of time. Emma touched her belongings with care, as if they might dissolve under her fingers. The stuffed bear she'd had since childhood, the row of novels on her bookshelf, the jewelry box where she'd kept her treasures. "Everything's still here," she whispered, sounding almost surprised. "Of course it is," Tyler said. "It was waiting for you. We all were." That first night established a pattern that would continue for weeks. Emma waking, screaming from nightmares. Mark rushing to her room, holding her until the panic subsided. Tyler appearing in the doorway, uncertain and afraid for his sister. The three of them eventually huddled together on Emma's bed, the television on low, no one wanting to return to the darkness alone. The persistent ringing of the doorbell became a daily irritation. Reporters seeking exclusive interviews, neighbors bringing casseroles and barely disguised curiosity, distant relatives suddenly interested in reconnecting. Mark fielded them all with increasing firmness, guarding Emma's privacy like a fortress. "Don't they have anything better to do?" Emma asked after the third news van parked outside their building in a week. "They will eventually," Mark assured her. "News cycles move on." The greater challenge proved to be Emma's anxiety when left alone. Even brief separations, Mark going to the kitchen while she sat in the living room, could trigger panic. The thought of him returning to work, even part-time, seemed impossible. "I can't leave her," Mark explained to Miller over the phone. "She's not ready, and honestly, neither am I." The department had been understanding, extending his leave of absence without question. Mark's singular focus on finding Emma had transformed into an equally intense dedication to her recovery. On Emma's fourth day home, Guardian appeared at the apartment window, yellow eyes peering in from the fire escape. Emma's face lit up, the first genuine smile Mark had seen since her rescue. "Can we let him in?" she asked. "Please." Mark hesitated, thinking of pet policies and security concerns, but couldn't deny her anything that brought that spark back to her eyes. He opened the window, and Guardian padded in with the confidence of a creature returning to its rightful place. Emma sat cross-legged on the floor, offering her hand to the cat, who sniffed it briefly before climbing directly into her lap. "He remembers me," she said softly, fingers gently stroking the tabby's fur. Tyler, initially wary of his sister's attachment to the stray, warmed to Guardian after witnessing how the cat's presence calmed Emma during anxiety attacks. "He's like her therapy cat," he explained to their grandparents during a visit. "Way better than the actual therapy." The truth was more complicated. Emma attended therapy sessions 3 times weekly, sometimes emerging tearful, sometimes angry, occasionally with a fragile sense of progress. The therapist explained to Mark that recovery wasn't linear. There would be steps forward and back, good days and bad. One particularly difficult afternoon, Tyler returned from school to find Mark sitting alone in the kitchen, head in his hands. "Is Emma okay?" he asked immediately, backpack sliding to the floor. Mark looked up, exhaustion evident in every line of his face. "She won't come out of her room. The therapist pushed a little harder today, asked about what happened in the cellar. She hasn't spoken since we got home." Tyler hesitated, then squared his shoulders. "I'll talk to her." Mark watched his son walk down the hall, knock softly on Emma's door, then enter without waiting for a response. An hour later, both children emerged, Emma's eyes red-rimmed but calm. They sat at the kitchen table while Tyler recounted mundane school drama involving his friends, Emma occasionally nodding or asking a quiet question. Later, after Emma had finally fallen asleep, Mark found Tyler in the living room. "What did you say to her?" he asked, genuine curiosity in his voice. Tyler shrugged. "Nothing special. I just told her about Jacob's stupid fight with Devin over that girl they both like. Normal stuff." He looked up at his father. "I think sometimes she just needs to remember that normal stuff still exists." The insight from his 12-year-old son humbled Mark. In his determination to help Emma heal, he'd been focusing on the trauma, the therapy, the recovery process, forgetting that healing also came from reconnecting with ordinary life. The next day, instead of rehashing her therapy session, Mark took Emma and Tyler for ice cream, deliberately steering the conversation toward lighthearted topics. Emma ate only half her cone, but smiled more than she had in weeks. As days turned into weeks, small victories accumulated. Emma venturing onto the apartment balcony alone, Tyler making her laugh with an impression of their science teacher. Emma finishing a complete meal for the first time, Mark and Tyler exchanging silent looks of triumph across the table. The routine of therapy sessions, doctor's appointments, and home tutoring established a rhythm to their days. Mark gradually returned to work half-days, his phone always within reach, rushing home at the slightest hint that Emma needed him. Guardian became a permanent fixture in their home, officially adopted after Mark filled out paperwork classifying the cat as an emotional support animal to bypass building regulations. The tabby seemed to have a sixth sense for Emma's emotional state, appearing at her side before anxiety attacks fully manifested, providing silent comfort during therapy homework. One evening, as Mark prepared dinner, he overheard Emma talking softly to the cat in her room. Pausing by the partially open door, he listened. "You knew he was gone, didn't you?" Emma whispered. "That's why you finally led them to me. You were waiting until it was safe." Mark's heart clenched. Despite the therapist's best efforts, Emma remained convinced that Garner's friends might still come for her, that Guardian was her early warning system. The investigation had yet to confirm or rule out accomplices, leaving them in a limbo of uncertainty. Tyler's voice called from the living room, breaking Mark's reverie. "Dad! Emma, come quick!" They rushed to join him, finding Tyler pointing at the television where breaking news banners scrolled across the screen. "Local authorities arrest 2 in connection with Emma Thompson abduction case," the headline read. Mark increased the volume as the news anchor detailed the arrests in a neighboring county. 2 men, found with evidence linking them to Garner and potentially to other missing children cases. Emma stood perfectly still, her face unreadable as she absorbed the news. Guardian wound around her ankles, tail twitching. "Are those the men?" Mark asked gently. "The ones he talked about?" Emma nodded slowly, arms wrapping around herself in a self-protective gesture. "He said they had an arrangement, that they would come for me if anything happened to him." Mark pulled her close, relief washing over him. "They can't hurt you now, Emma. They're going to prison for a very long time. Later that night, Mark found Emma on the balcony, Guardian purring in her lap as she gazed at the stars. For the first time since her return, she seemed truly at peace. "You know what the scariest part was?" she said without looking at him. "Not the dark or the cold or even him. It was thinking you might have given up looking for me." Mark settled into the chair beside her. "Never. Not for a single moment." Emma smiled, continuing to stroke Guardian's fur. "I know that now." When Emma finally asked about the kidnapper, Mark hesitated before revealing the truth, unaware that his answer would trigger in Emma a reaction no one had anticipated. A smile of relief, followed by words that chilled his blood. "He said he would come back for me." Mark sat at the edge of Emma's bed, trying to make sense of what she had just said about the kidnapper's supposed friends coming for her. "I need you to explain exactly what he told you, Emma," Mark said, keeping his voice steady despite the alarm bells ringing in his mind. Emma pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders, her eyes distant as she recalled the threats. "He would get phone calls sometimes. I could hear him talking to someone when he thought I couldn't hear. He'd get angry or sometimes scared. One time, after a call, he came down to the cellar and told me that I better behave, because if anything happened to him, his friends would come for me." "Did he ever mention names?" Mark asked, mentally cataloging every detail. "Or say how many friends there were?" Emma shook her head. "He just called them his associates or his friends. He said they had an arrangement." She looked up at Mark, her expression unnervingly calm. "He said they knew where I was, that they were watching the property, and that if he didn't check in regularly, they'd know something was wrong." Mark fought to keep his expression neutral, not wanting to add to Emma's fear. But inside, his mind raced through the implications. Were these threats real, or just Garner's way of ensuring Emma wouldn't attempt to escape, even if an opportunity presented itself? The photos found among Garner's possessions suggested he hadn't acted alone, but that didn't necessarily mean his friends knew about Emma specifically. "Did you ever see anyone else? Or hear other voices at the property?" "No," Emma admitted. "But sometimes I'd hear a car arrive when it wasn't his usual time. He'd go upstairs, and I could hear footsteps and muffled voices. He always made sure I was locked in and quiet before anyone came." Mark nodded, squeezing her hand gently. "The police are investigating everything, Emma, and we have protection outside the apartment at all times. You're safe now." But even as he spoke the reassuring words, Mark wasn't entirely convinced. He'd been a police officer long enough to know that predators like Garner rarely operated completely alone. They had networks, accomplices, people who shared their twisted interests. After Emma finally fell asleep, Mark called Miller immediately. "We need to take these threats seriously," Mark said after explaining what Emma had told him. "Garner might have been bluffing, but we can't take that chance." "I agree," Miller replied, his voice grave. "The forensic team is still going through his electronic devices. If he was communicating with accomplices, we'll find evidence." He paused. "In the meantime, I'll arrange for additional security at your building. Unmarked, so we don't scare Emma, but they'll be there." The next morning, Mark canceled his half-day at work, unwilling to leave Emma even with the babysitter who had been carefully vetted by the department. The mere possibility of accomplices had reignited all his protective instincts. Emma noticed his hovering immediately. "You're not going to work?" "Thought I'd take a day off," Mark said casually, setting a plate of toast in front of her. "Maybe we could watch a movie or something." Emma gave him a look far too knowing for her 14 years. "You're worried about what I told you, about his friends." Mark considered deflecting, then thought better of it. Emma had endured too many lies already. "Yes, I am, but not because I think you're in immediate danger. It's just better to be cautious while the police investigate." Emma nodded, absently stroking Guardian, who had jumped onto the chair beside her. "He senses it too," she said, indicating the cat. He's been extra alert since yesterday. Keeps watching the windows. Mark followed her gaze to the tabby, who indeed seemed more vigilant than usual. Ears perked at the slightest sound from outside. The rational part of Mark's brain knew cats couldn't understand human conversations or complex threats. Yet he couldn't dismiss the animal's uncanny awareness that had already saved Emma once. Tyler arrived home from school that afternoon to find the apartment in a state of heightened security. New locks on the windows, a camera system Mark had installed that morning, and his father checking the peephole before opening the door. "What's going on?" Tyler asked, eyes darting between his father and sister. Mark explained the situation in terms carefully chosen not to frighten him, but Tyler was perceptive. "You think someone else might try to take Emma?" he asked bluntly. "We're just being careful," Mark replied. "The police are investigating, and there's security outside." Tyler's response surprised both of them. He walked to his room without a word, returning moments later with a baseball bat. He placed it strategically behind the front door. "Just in case," he said with a shrug, then proceeded to the kitchen to make a sandwich as if he hadn't just prepared for home defense at age 12. That night, none of them could sleep well. Emma had a panic attack around midnight, convinced she'd heard someone trying to open her window. Mark checked the security system. Nothing had been triggered. But he physically inspected every entrance anyway, finding nothing amiss. It was just the wind, he assured her, though the night was still. "Can I sleep in your room?" Emma asked, her voice small. Soon all three Thompsons were huddled in Mark's king-sized bed, Tyler and Emma finally drifting off, while Mark kept watch. Guardian curled at the foot of the bed like a furry sentinel. The therapist called it hypervigilance when Mark mentioned Emma's increased anxiety during her session the next day. "It's a common response to trauma," Dr. Winters explained. "Now that Emma feels physically safe, her mind is processing the fear she suppressed during captivity. The threats Garner made about accomplices give her anxiety a specific focus." "But what if the threats were real?" Mark pressed. Dr. Winters considered this carefully. "Even if they were, constantly reinforcing the fear doesn't help Emma. She needs to rebuild her sense of security, not justify her hypervigilance." The advice made sense clinically, but was harder to implement in reality. How could Mark discourage Emma's vigilance when he shared it? When he found himself checking the security footage multiple times per hour, scanning for unfamiliar faces. A breakthrough came unexpectedly 3 nights later. An anonymous call to the apartment, nothing but silence on the other end when Mark answered. Despite his attempts to keep it from Emma, she saw his face change as he listened to the nothingness on the line. "It's them, isn't it?" she whispered after he hung up. The fear in her eyes pushed Mark to a decision. He couldn't let Emma live like this, jumping at shadows, seeing threats in every unexplained noise. Even if the danger was real, this existence wasn't living. It was just another form of captivity. "Emma," he said firmly, sitting beside her on the couch, "I need you to listen to me. You are safe. Tyler is safe. I will never let anyone hurt either of you again." "But..." "No buts. We have security measures in place. The police are investigating, but we can't live in fear forever." He took her hands in his. "Do you trust me?" Emma nodded without hesitation. "Then trust that I'm doing everything humanly possible to protect you. Your job isn't to be vigilant or afraid. Your job is to heal, to be 14 again, to laugh with your brother, and argue about whose turn it is to choose the movie." Something shifted in Emma's expression. A releasing of tension she'd been carrying for so long, it had become part of her. "But what if I can't remember how to be normal?" "You don't have to be normal," Mark said softly. "You just have to be you. Whatever that looks like now." That conversation marked a turning point. Emma began engaging more with her online schoolwork, even mentioning the possibility of returning to regular school for the spring semester. She started texting with a few close friends who had been vetted by Mark. Small steps, but significant ones. The anonymous calls continued sporadically, always silent, always from untraceable numbers. Mark reported each one to Miller, who increased patrols near the apartment, but found no concrete evidence of surveillance or imminent threat. It could be journalists trying to get a reaction, Miller suggested during one of his regular visits. Or classmates playing cruel pranks. We're monitoring, but so far, nothing indicates a direct connection to Garner. Mark wanted to believe this explanation, but something kept nagging at him. The timing of the calls seemed deliberate, often when Emma was alone in the apartment with the babysitter while Mark worked, as if the caller knew their schedule. His concern deepened when Emma's therapist reported that Emma had seen a suspicious man watching the building from across the street during her afternoon appointment. The police found no one matching the description, and security camera footage showed only usual neighborhood activity. She might be projecting her fears, Dr. Winters suggested gently, seeing threats where there are none. It's a common manifestation of PTSD. But 2 days later, Guardian's behavior changed dramatically. The normally calm cat began pacing restlessly by the windows, fur raised, emitting low growls at seemingly nothing. Emma, who had been making steady progress, regressed almost immediately. "He sees something," she insisted, refusing to leave her room. "He knows they're watching." That night, as Mark checked the security cameras for the dozenth time, he noticed a gray sedan parked 2 blocks away, the same car he'd seen 3 days earlier in nearly the same spot. Coincidence, perhaps, but his instincts as both a father and a police officer were screaming at him. He called Miller immediately. "I need you to run a plate for me." The next morning, Miller appeared at the door with an expression that Mark knew well. The investigation of the kidnapper's belongings had revealed photos of other children, including some who were still missing, suggesting he had not acted alone. Mark stared at the evidence spread across his kitchen table, photographs of children he'd never seen before, some smiling from school portraits, others caught unaware through telephoto lenses. Miller stood opposite him, his expression grim as he explained the findings. These were hidden in a locked trunk in Garner's cabin. At least 5 different children, Mark, dating back 8 years. Miller pointed to a particularly disturbing image. This girl went missing from Oak Ridge County in 2018. Never found. Mark's throat tightened. And these 2 men we arrested, they're definitely connected. Phone records don't lie. Garner called both of them multiple times in the days before and after Emma's abduction. And when we searched their properties... Miller pulled out another photograph, this one showing a room similar to the cellar where Emma had been held. They were building another holding area, recently. The implications chilled Mark to the bone. Emma's warnings about the others hadn't been delusions or manipulation by Garner. They'd been terrifyingly real. "Does Emma need to identify them?" Mark asked, already dreading the prospect of subjecting his daughter to that trauma. Miller shook his head. "Not necessary. The evidence is overwhelming. Photographs, communications, physical evidence linking them to at least 3 cases. They're not getting out, Mark. Ever." Relief washed over him. "Have you told the families of the other children?" "Process is starting today," Miller confirmed. "Some of them have been waiting for answers for years." A sound from the hallway made both men turn. Emma stood in the doorway, Guardian at her feet, her expression unnervingly calm as she took in the photographs on the table. "You found them," she said simply. "The men he talked to." Mark quickly gathered the photographs, shielding her from the worst images. "Yes, sweetheart. They're in custody. They can't hurt you or anyone else ever again." Emma nodded, processing this information with the strange maturity that had emerged from her ordeal. "Can I go back to school now? Real school, I mean." The question caught Mark off guard. For months, the focus had been on therapy, on healing, on creating a safe environment within their apartment. The idea of Emma returning to the outside world, to the ordinary dangers of teenage life, seemed simultaneously mundane and terrifying. "If that's what you want," he said carefully. "But there's no rush. You can continue with the home tutoring until you feel completely ready." "I'm ready now," Emma said with quiet determination. "I don't want to hide anymore." Later that evening, as a spring rain tapped gently against the windows, Mark called Tyler and Emma to the living room for a family meeting. Guardian settled on the couch between the siblings, a gray sentinel keeping watch. "I want to talk about next steps," Mark began. "Now that we know the threat is over, we can start thinking about getting back to normal life, whatever that looks like for us now." Tyler, who had been living with his grandparents during the week and spending weekends at the apartment, perked up. "Does that mean I can move back home for good?" "If that's what you want," Mark said, surprised by his son's eagerness. "I thought you might prefer to stay with Grandma and Grandpa until the school year ends." Tyler shook his head emphatically. "No way. I want to be here, especially if Emma's going back to school." Emma smiled, a genuine smile that reached her eyes, still too rare but increasingly frequent. "Someone has to make sure I don't forget how the cafeteria works." Mark felt a warmth spreading through his chest. After months of fragmentation, his family was knitting itself back together, altered but intact. "Emma, the school counselor suggested you start with half days," Mark continued. "Just mornings at first, then build up gradually." Emma nodded. "That sounds reasonable. When can I start?" "Monday," Mark said, "if you're sure you're ready." "I'm sure," Emma replied, absently stroking Guardian's fur. "I need to see something besides these walls and doctor's offices." A montage of transitions marked the following weeks. The removal of the extra security cameras from the apartment, the last home tutoring session, Emma trying on old clothes, discovering which ones still fit her recovering body, Tyler permanently moving his belongings back into his room, complaining good-naturedly about Guardian sleeping on his bed when Emma's door was closed. Spring blossomed into early summer, the changing season mirroring the transformation in the Thompson household. Emma's first day back at school, half a day as planned, was marked by a mixture of curiosity from classmates and protective hovering from teachers. She returned home exhausted but triumphant. "Everyone stared," she reported to Mark. "But Jenna and Mackenzie sat with me at lunch, just like before." Each small victory built upon the last. Emma attending a full day of school, Emma going to the mall with friends, accompanied by Margaret, who kept a discreet distance. Emma sleeping through the night without nightmares, at least occasionally. The family therapy sessions continued, now focused less on crisis management and more on rebuilding healthy patterns. In one particularly productive session, Tyler finally expressed the complicated emotions he'd been suppressing. "Sometimes I felt guilty for being angry that you were gone," he admitted to Emma. "Like I was sad and scared for you. But I was also mad that everything fell apart because of you disappearing." Emma reached for her brother's hand. "You're allowed to feel whatever you feel, Tyler. I was angry sometimes, too. At Dad for not finding me sooner. At myself for walking home alone that day. At everything." Mark watched his children with a mixture of heartache and pride. They were navigating emotional complexities that many adults struggled with, finding their way with a wisdom born from suffering. A year to the day after Emma's rescue, Mark received news that transformed their lives once again. Chief Randall called him into his office at the station, closing the door for privacy. "Thompson, I've been reviewing your service record," the chief began. "Not just the last year, but your entire career with us." Mark tensed, uncertain where this was heading. "Your dedication during your daughter's disappearance was unorthodox, certainly. But ultimately, your instincts were right." The chief pushed a folder across the desk. "The department is creating a new child recovery and protection unit, specialized training in missing children cases. We want you to head it." Mark stared at the folder, speechless. A year ago, he'd been on the verge of losing his badge permanently. Now he was being offered a promotion, a chance to transform his personal nightmare into a resource that might save other children. "You understand what families are going through in a way most officers can't," the chief continued. "Your experience, however painful, is valuable. Think about it. Talk it over with your kids." That evening, Mark shared the news with Emma and Tyler over dinner. Their reactions surprised him. "You should definitely do it, Dad," Tyler said immediately. Emma nodded in agreement. "You could help other kids like me, other families like ours." "It would mean longer hours sometimes," Mark cautioned. "More responsibility." Emma smiled. "We're not the same family we were a year ago, Dad. Tyler and I aren't babies. We can handle it." The next morning, Mark found himself removing the last of the extra security measures from their apartment. The motion sensors by the windows, the reinforced locks that had transformed their home into a fortress. Each piece represented a fear they no longer needed to carry. "We need to let Guardian out more," Emma observed, watching the cat pace restlessly by the door. "He's getting bored being inside all the time." Mark realized she was right. In their concern for Emma's safety, they'd kept Guardian as confined as she had been. It was time for all of them to reclaim their freedom. The true test came 2 weeks later. Emma, now 15, asked if she could walk home from school alone. The request froze Mark's blood, images of her previous disappearance flashing unbidden through his mind. "It's 3 blocks, Dad," Emma reasoned, "in broad daylight. Tyler will be with me, and I can't stay afraid forever." He wanted to refuse, to insist on continuing to drive her, to protect her from every possible danger. But he recognized the determination in her eyes, the same stubborn resilience that had kept her alive during captivity. "Okay," he finally agreed. "But you text me when you leave school, and again when you get home. No detours, no exceptions." The day Emma walked home for the first time, Mark couldn't focus on anything at work. Despite his promise not to hover, he found himself parked a block from the school, watching from a distance as Emma and Tyler emerged from the building and started their journey home. They walked side by side, Tyler gesturing animatedly as he talked, Emma laughing at something he said. And trailing behind them at a respectful distance, a gray shadow, Guardian, somehow having escaped the apartment to accompany them on their walk. Mark followed in his car, staying far enough back that they wouldn't notice, watching as his children navigated the ordinary world with extraordinary courage. When they reached their building safely, he exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Tyler spotted the patrol car just before they entered their building. He nudged Emma and nodded subtly in Mark's direction, a knowing smile spreading across his face. "I think Guardian isn't the only Guardian following us," he commented. Emma looked over her shoulder, catching sight of her father's poorly concealed surveillance. Instead of being annoyed, she smiled softly. "It's okay. Some shadows are comforting." That night, Mark found Emma on the balcony, stroking Guardian while gazing at the stars. When she said, "Some scars never disappear, but we learn to live with them, don't we?" he understood that his daughter had found a wisdom that even he didn't possess, the ability to transform trauma into strength.